We return to our next item of business, which is a public audit and post-legislative scrutiny committee debate on motion 19160 in the name of Jenny Mara on post-legislative scrutiny Control of Dogs Scotland Act 2010. I would encourage all members who wish to contribute to this debate to press their request to speak buttons, and I call on Jenny Mara to speak to and to move the motion.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I start by moving the motion in my name? And on behalf of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee, I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to discuss the committee's scrutiny of the Control of Dogs Scotland Act 2010 with colleagues from across the Chamber and across parties this afternoon. In May 2018, this Chamber debated a motion by Alec MSP, a member of the committee, calling for post-legislative scrutiny of the 2010 Act. After hearing stories from other members of the committee of out-of-control and dangerous dogs throughout Scotland, the committee unanimously agreed that it was important that the effectiveness of the 2010 Act was scrutinised. The committee issued its call for evidence on 3rd of July 2019 and received 49 responses from local authorities, animal welfare organisations, medical practitioners, representative bodies and members of the public. From the submissions we received, it quickly became clear that wider dog control issues, primarily those falling under the scope of the Dangerous Dogs Act 1991, were also of great concern to members of the public. The committee began its scrutiny by holding 3 public engagement events, Presiding Officer, in Airdrie, in Dalkeith and in Dundee, where members heard shocking stories of people and pets being attacked by out-of-control dogs. Members of the public attending these sessions also shared their frustrations around the subsequent actions of the enforcement bodies, primarily police and local councils. The committee began its formal oral evidence by hearing from parents whose young children had been attacked and seriously injured by dogs. I think, Presiding Officer, we all felt that it was one of the most powerful committee meetings we had ever attended. We listened in horror as Claire Booth and Lisa Grady spoke of the dog attacks on their children and the life-changing injuries they received as a result. We were humbled as Veronica and John Lynch bravely shared with us the events around the tragic incident where their daughter Kelly, at only 11 years of age, sustained fatal injuries when she was attacked by 2 Rottweilers. Presiding Officer, Kelly was due to start St John's High School with me that summer. Our year group was much the poorer for her absence. The committee and I personally thank those parents and their bravery, along with each and every person who shared their experiences with us. It reinforced to the committee just how important it is to have effective dog control legislation in place and the consequences if we don't. We also heard from medical professionals who treat patients that have been injured in dog attacks. We heard from Dr. Alistair Corfield from the Royal College of Emergency Medicine that he considers that every dog bite injury is a significant event. We heard from Dr. Judy Evans from the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh, who told us that for every child who comes into the plastic surgeons with a dog bite injury, there will not just be one patient, there will be at least 5. There will be parents and perhaps grandparents too, all adding to the burden of our NHS in Scotland. We heard from the Communication Workers Union, who told us that there have been 2,500 postal workers attacked since the Act came in 2010. We also heard from local authorities and dog wardens of the challenges they face when attempting to enforce dog control legislation. Presiding Officer, some of the members of the Communication Workers Union have joined us in the gallery today. They are posties, some of whom have been savagely attacked by dogs. There have been 129 attacks on Royal Mail employees in Scotland since April just this year. If there had been 129 assaults on postal workers by other people, I have no doubt this would be taken a lot more seriously. John is in the gallery, Presiding Officer. He's a postie and he works in Dumfries. He was savagely attacked a year ago by a dog. His arm was horrifically injured and he has been left with permanent disfigurement and disability in his arm. He is 60. He told me that he had 3 firsts that day. He'd never been in an ambulance, he'd never had an operation, it tells you the burden on the NHS, and he'd never been in Glasgow, surprisingly enough. John is bravely but necessarily back at his work. But this is the scale of the threat our workers face every day, as they have more and more contact with householders, and by consequence dogs, because they deliver an increasing amount of parcels, which forces them to go to the door and be welcomed into the house or have a transaction at the doorstep. Now, this is the Royal Mail and the CWU, but the story of and safety of care workers who spend a lot of time in people's homes, other delivery people and Amazon drivers is untold, because these industries are not as well organised or represented. But make no mistake, the threat to them is just as grave. Presiding Officer, let me turn to the committee's conclusions. We heard the evidence and we concluded that current dog control law in Scotland is not fit for purpose. We thought this was a national crisis of safety for our children and our citizens. We recommended that the Scottish Government undertake a comprehensive review of all dog control legislation without delay. The committee also set out recommendations in its report to improve the implementation of the 2010 Act in the interim. I'd like to thank the Minister for her response to the committee's report. I welcome her commitment to undertake a review to look at improving the operational effectiveness of the 2010 Act, followed by a wider review to look at the Dangerous Dogs Act 1991. However, I seek assurances today that the Minister fully understands the gravity and public safety aspects of this situation, as I was not convinced that she demonstrated full understanding of the issues when she came to committee. In its report, the committee set out a range of issues that should be addressed as part of that wider review. It stated that action needs to be taken now to tackle dog attacks, and it identified actions that would allow us to do so. The committee welcomes the Minister's commitment to undertake these 2 reviews and asks that she provides the Parliament with detailed timescales for these reviews and, crucially, what issues she anticipates they will include. The committee asked that a public awareness campaign around the 2010 Act was undertaken as a matter of urgency, and that it must include materials specifically directed at children and parents of children. The committee notes the Scottish Government's intention to develop a social media campaign in the next few months, and we would like today a clearer indication of timescale for this and how it plans to direct the campaign at children. The committee also seeks a timescale for the Scottish Government engaging with local authorities on more tailored approaches to raising awareness of the 2010 Act. Presiding Officer, Parliament voted in 2010 as part of the Control of Dogs Act to establish a dog control notice database. Now, this is important because, like the Public Audit Committee has identified across a whole range of government policy, there is a grave absence of data and evidence for the government to make its policy on. So way back in 2010, when Christine Graham was passing this bill, the Parliament agreed that a database was a sensible way forward. It would allow the government to keep track of where dogs are, where attacks have happened, if dogs who have attacked are then moving around the country with families to other local authority areas. But to date, the government has failed to enact this 9 years later. The National Dog Wardens Association of Scotland told the committee that the Scottish Government's failure to set up that database was a big miss. I would like to ask the Minister today why she feels the need to consult again on this database when Parliament already consulted on and debated its merits 9 years ago. Why put us through more expense and delay on this? If she could commit today to enact the powers that the Parliament already passed and establish that database, I think that would give committee members some comfort. Yes.
Stuart Stevenson.
While I agree entirely with the point that's being made, does the member recall that in the Stage 3 debate on the bill, it was reported that at that stage in April 2010, the committee was not supporting the establishment of a database, while accepting it was proper at Section 8 of the bill to put in a provision if it were required at a later date?
Jenny Mara.
I think Stuart Stevenson raises a valid point. It still doesn't answer the question in my head, Presiding Officer, why Parliament passed this power, but 9 years later absolutely nothing has been done about it. But if the Minister can address that when she speaks, I would be very grateful. Presiding Officer, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the evidence we took on one free bite. Now, this will surprise you, Presiding Officer, but our courts have this rule that if a dog bites, can permanently injure and disfigure a person, if there was no reasonable apprehension or even a thought that that dog might bite, then effectively the dog and the owner get off scot-free. Presiding Officer, this was thought in our committee to be a real problem, an anomaly in the law. And I spoke to one person through our consideration of this evidence who was absolutely appalled that she had been disfigured and the owner of that dog was let off scot-free by our courts because of the one free bite rule. We took evidence from the Faculty of Advocates and the Crown Office, but if the Minister could review this law, which I think is unreasonable now in Scotland, then I think as part of the wider review of legislation, that would be very welcome. Presiding Officer, locally, the committee is pleased to note that several local authorities are now proactively meeting local police and councils to help form better working relationships. Now, this may sound a technical point, but it was absolutely crucial in the evidence we took because we found that because dog control law is spread over local councils and police, there was a real misunderstanding, especially amongst the police, I have to add, of the powers that they had and who is responsible for enacting these powers and taking control of a situation where a dog incident has occurred. East Dunbartonshire Council in particular has undertaken to discuss all cases with local police officers and agree a suitable course of enforcement action in each instance. We welcome that, but we would really encourage this to happen right across the country. Minister, I know, it's promotion there. Another aspect we would really like to see soon is data collection in hospitals. We were told by a doctor that they reckon there was 5,000 incidents of people going to A&E with dog bites across Scotland. But we have no hard data collected by your government of that. And I think it would be simple recording mechanisms in hospitals and in A&Es to get a full extent of this problem if we were able to collect that information. Presiding Officer, for workers, for families and especially children, this is a grave public safety concern. The posties I met at lunchtime fear a fatality among their workers or other home workers. And 30 years on from the death of Dundee schoolgirl Kelly Lynch, we think there are more dogs. We don't know because of the lack of data. The threat is greater, but there are not better laws to protect our citizens. I think we have quite a unique opportunity now with the Minister's commitment to review these two pieces of legislation and consult. I hope this Parliament can come to a consensus and seize this opportunity to make our communities safer, especially for our children. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now call on the Minister, Ashton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome today's Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee debate on the very important issue of control of dogs. And I am very grateful to the committee and also to the clerking team for preparing their very comprehensive report. I also thank those who provided evidence to the committee, and in particular, families affected by the traumatic and tragic experiences of serious dog attacks. The Scottish Government has responded last month to the recommendations which were directed to us, and I will use my speech to explain some of the actions that we are taking to strengthen the operational effectiveness of the Control of Dogs Scotland Act 2010. So at the outset, I'd like to confirm that the Scottish Government is committed to helping keep communities safe from irresponsible dog owners and their out-of-control dogs. And that is why the Scottish Government is progressing 2 reviews, exploring steps to be taken to improve the dog control legislative regime. The first review, published last week, will look at practical measures that can be taken to improve the operational effectiveness of the Control of Dogs Act. And the second review, which we will publish next year, will look at the wider dog control legislative area, including whether the Dangerous Dogs Act of 1991 should be reformed. And I will discuss in more detail both of these reviews shortly. But first, Presiding Officer, I believe it's important to reflect that the vast majority of Scotland's estimated 600,000 dog owners are responsible dog owners who take good care of their animals and enjoy the widespread benefits of dog ownership. And of course, we know that owning and caring for a dog can bring many benefits. However, owning a dog also brings with it some very important responsibilities. And that, of course, includes keeping your dog under effective control within our communities. And it is unfortunate that a small minority of owners do not do this, which can then put public safety at risk. In 2013-14, the Scottish Government consulted on measures to better promote responsible dog ownership in Scotland. And in 2015, we announced our intention to make microchipping of all dogs compulsory, that allowing authorities to identify a dog's owner, and this came into force from April 2016. In May 2016, the Scottish Government issued a protocol detailing the responsibilities of different bodies in dealing with irresponsible dog ownership. And as the committee found in their evidence, this protocol has been welcomed as clarifying the responsibilities of different enforcement agencies. Presiding Officer, evidence is crucial in understanding the extent of issues relating to out-of-control dogs. And as the report found, there is a lack of comprehensive data as to the full extent of the current problem of out-of-control dogs. And there's also a lack of data showing how the problems associated with out-of-control dogs have changed over time. The data that is held relates to dog owners where formal action has been taken against them through the justice system or by local authorities. And it's noteworthy that the number of prosecutions under the Dangerous Dogs Act of 91 for dog owners who allowed their dogs to be dangerously out of control is down 1/3 between 2012-13 and 2017-18. And of course.
Liam Kerr.
I'm very grateful. The Communications Workers Union is concerned that police and prosecutors deny that a one free bite rule exists. What is the Minister's position on one free bite?
Minister.
I believe that what the member is referring to there is the term reasonable apprehension. So Jenny Mara has obviously described this during her contribution earlier. But I have seen the letter from the Communication Postal Workers, and I'd be very happy to meet with them to discuss all of their concerns face to face, and I'm sure they would be willing to take up that offer. So over broadly the same period, the number of out-of-control dogs, so that's the ones where dog control notices have been issued under the 2010 Act, in the year 2017-18 was at the highest level that it's been since the DCN regime was introduced in 2011. However, as the report acknowledges, there is a lack of regular data showing the effect of out-of-control dogs, and that is a lack of regular data showing the number of injuries associated with dog bites or dog attacks. And clearly, this type of information is important in understanding the extent of the problems associated with irresponsible dog ownership, as they are now, and how the extent of this problem has changed over time. We have some information from individual NHS boards in response to FOI requests on injuries caused by dogs, but it's far from the full picture. So what I can say today is that within the very real constraints of adding new recording burdens to the NHS, I do absolutely acknowledge that steps need to be considered to see if more regular data in this area can be routinely collected. Without this, I will.
Briefly, Ms. Mann.
I thank the Minister for giving way on that point. I completely appreciate what she says about adding burdens to doctors as they record these things, but a simple tick box for dog attack would give us a much better understanding of this issue and might let us prevent these things in the future that wouldn't end up in A&E in the first place.
Minister.
Yes, and that's absolutely why that is something that I am going to look at and see if it is possible to do it. So without this data, it's going to be difficult to build up a set of data to understand the full extent of the problems associated with out-of-control dogs. And this, in turn, is essential to help develop an evidence-based policy and operational enforcement response to irresponsible dog owners and the problems created by their dogs. So the committee received evidence regarding the role and practice of independent enforcement agencies. And members should be aware that a key consideration of whether it is the legal framework or the way it is used by these agencies which requires improvement. And while the report rightly raised a number of issues relating to the legal framework, how independent enforcement agencies such as Police Scotland or local authorities use their powers is critical. And I'm afraid to say that the committee found a wide variation of approach of different local authorities in the use of powers under the 2010 Act. Some local authorities have barely issued any DCNs since the Act came in, and changes to legislation will make very little difference if local authorities do not seek to use their powers. The committee also heard evidence from Police Scotland, themselves acknowledging, and I quote, that inconsistent knowledge across the country, close quote, among police officers as to an understanding of their dog control enforcement powers. Effective and consistent enforcement across Scotland is fundamental in helping address issues relating to out-of-control dogs. And the 2010 Act brought in a preventative regime. And as the report makes clear, changes to the 2010 Act, in light of the experience of its use, could further aid local authorities in their enforcement efforts. And that is the subject of the first review published last week. So practical improvements that can assist local authorities as they discharge their functions under the 2010 Act. The Scottish Government review published last week seeks views on such steps as more powers being available for local authority authorised officers when dealing with dog owners, establishment of a national dog control notice database, seizing of potentially dangerous or out-of-control dogs, the sharing of information with people who make reports on out-of-control dogs, new fixed penalty notice powers for breaches of dog control notices, awareness raising of local authority dog control powers, and updating statutory guidance and the non-statutory protocol used by enforcement agencies. And views offered on these practical measures assisting the use of the 2010 Act powers will inform the next steps taken by the Scottish Government. Presiding Officer, the report also suggested more fundamental changes to the law relating to control of dogs. And the Scottish Government will publish a wider review next year looking at the wider reform to dog control legislation. This review will include the suggestion in the report of reducing the threshold of criminal liability of dog owners for the behaviour of their dogs. The effect of dog attacks can be tragic, and I want to explore in next year's review, as the committee has recommended, whether a dog owner should be fully responsible for the actions of their dog if an attack takes place. The way the current law works is that where a dog attack occurs, there requires to be what is called reasonable apprehension on the part of the owner that the dog may injure a person. Changing this so that, for example, reasonable apprehension was no longer part of the way the criminal offence works would be a significant shift in the law, and members will, I think, understand that this needs to be carefully assessed to ensure fairness for all without any unintended consequences. Presiding Officer, I'll listen carefully to the views offered in today's debate, and I want to thank again the committee for looking at this issue and the way that they did so. However, it's also clear that independent enforcement agencies such as local authorities and Police Scotland should also respond to issues that were raised in the report. Awareness amongst relevant staff of the powers that exist needs to be improved. Application of these powers needs to be more consistent. Information sharing between enforcement agencies needs to build on existing best practice. And all of these things, coupled with changes to improve the operational effectiveness of the 2010 Act, can lead to the preventative regime of dog control, helping to reduce the number of dog attacks that take place.
Thank you very much, Minister. I call on Bill Bowman to be followed by James Kelly. Bill Bowman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to open the debate on behalf of the Conservatives who will be supporting the motion today. I would also like to begin as a member of the committee by thanking the clerking team, Spice, and especially the witnesses who contributed to this very valuable inquiry. I follow on from the convener's remarks and would say I would agree and support what she said. Today's debate on the control of dogs takes into account the impact of the law and personal experiences of people dealing with the law in its current form. I also attended the evidence session in Dundee with the convener and can attest as to how hearing someone recount their experiences was harrowing, not only for those recounting but also for those listening, and I will not repeat the details here. This process reinforced my determination that the post-legislative scrutiny process here should be relevant and lead to positive action. Today's debate addresses issues of responsible dog ownership and recommendations made by the committee regarding its findings. I agree with the conclusions of the committee outlined in the report's executive summary and believe they merit repeating, specifically the following 3 points which strike me as being particularly significant. These are the belief by the committee that this Act has limited effect, that the law is not fit for purpose, and that the recommendations made in the interim be acted upon immediately. These points hold significance for a number of reasons. Firstly, the committee considers that had the 2010 Act been effective in achieving its objective of ensuring that dogs which are out of control are brought and kept under control, there should have been a consequential reduction in prosecutions under the 1991 UK Act and in the number of individuals requiring hospital treatment following dog attacks. The Minister mentioned certain figures, but the figures we had from 2017 show that this was not the case. Secondly, the belief that the law is not fit for purpose was widely expressed through the evidence sessions held by the committee. During these sessions, it became clear that concerns around out-of-control dogs and dangerous dogs arose, not only because of the ineffectiveness of the 2010 Act, but also due to weaknesses in all dog control law. For example, the committee recommended that when implementing legislation, the Scottish Government should make no distinction between Scottish Government-initiated legislation and members' bills. The committee found that insufficient resources, such as limited numbers of dog wardens, had negatively impacted on local authorities' ability to implement the 2010 Act, and that victims of dog attacks should be entitled to know the outcome of the action that had been taken against the owner of the dog by the local authority. Finally, in this section, the committee recognises that the purpose of the 2010 Act was to provide an important tool to prevent dog attacks from occurring. However, its success is dependent on members of the public being aware of the Act and how it can be used. I believe that an awareness-raising programme to address issues of data collection and of the joint protocol which coordinates the efforts of local authorities and emergency services and resource allocation is long overdue and should be undertaken as a matter of urgency. Furthermore, the committee recommended that assessments be made of the scale of the public health impact of dog bites and the associated cost implications to determine if a multi-agency public health approach to tackling dog control issues is also required. Proposals for improved data collection in the form of a national database has been raised already and are strongly supported by the committee, and the lack of one was identified as one of the key witnesses to the effectiveness of the 2010 Act. The committee recommended that a Scottish Dog Control Notice database, which Scottish ministers have had the power to establish since the Act came into force in 2011, be established immediately. Based on the evidence received by the committee, it is clear that such a database containing information on dog control activity would be a valuable tool in improving the effectiveness of the Act. Furthermore, the committee considered that the failure of the Scottish ministers to use the powers given to them under the 2010 Act to establish this database to be unacceptable and must be urgently rectified. The point of inadequate resource was continually raised, and the committee identified that an insufficient number of dog wardens has negatively impacted on local authorities' ability to implement the 2010 Act and the effectiveness of the Act in reducing the number of out-of-control dogs. Subsequently, the committee found that the Scottish Government should obtain the following data from each local authority without delay. Firstly, the number of authorised officers that have been appointed under Section 1.6 of the Control of Dogs Scotland Act. Secondly, whether the role is standalone has just been added into other roles, which clearly would reduce the impact of that. And finally, the training that has been given to authorised officers. Issues relating to both a lack of centralised data collection and resource become evident when assessing the role of the joint protocol that I previously mentioned, and responsibility between emergency services and local authorities. It seems to me that logically, general practitioners, hospitals, local authorities and Police Scotland should be required to record and collect regularly consistent data on reported incidences of out-of-control dogs and related attacks. This would ensure that records of attacks can be collected and checked against any dog control notices and related fixed penalty notices that have been issued, as well as assess resources available to each local authority. The implementation of this recommendation without delay would mean that local authorities would be less reliant on victims of attacks and members of the public reporting breaches of dog control notices. It would also mean a more streamlined approach to interpretation of GDPR rules across all local authorities, an issue that we heard about being an excuse, if that's the polite way of saying, for not giving out information. And it would mean more consideration taken on behalf of the victim in following up outcomes of the action that had been taken against the owner of a dog by the local authority. Statements from Glasgow Council, the British Small Animal Veterinary Association and the Communication Workers Union support this position, giving evidence that the implementation of the Act is very varied across local authority areas with no real consistency in how the function is carried out. It is at present unable to achieve its intended impact on dog control and irresponsible ownership, and that the legislation needs urgent consolidation, simplification and amendment. So, concluding, Presiding Officer, the evidence clearly demonstrates the need for immediate action regarding legislation on the control of dangerous dogs. The Government seems to broadly support the recommendations of the report, however, appears to be lacking the determination which would lead to urgent joined-up action to properly reflect the seriousness of the Act's real-life consequences. And as the convener has mentioned, we can no longer afford to be complacent. There is widespread enthusiasm for initiatives from stakeholders, such as a centralised data collection system, which would decrease confusion over responsibility within the joint protocol under which the legislation and the bringing together of all dog control law to provide clarity to the public, local authorities and the police on handling out-of-control dangerous dogs. It is with these recommendations in mind, Presiding Officer, that I urge the Government to directly consider them and move to enact the Committee's recommendations with all due haste. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call James Kelly to be followed by Alec Neil. James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start first of all by thanking the committee for the work that they've undertaken on this issue. I think it highlights the important role of post-legislative scrutiny. We pass a lot of legislation in this Parliament and we've got a responsibility to ensure that it actually achieves its purpose. And I think the work that the Audit Committee has done, not just in this regard to this legislation, but in other pieces of work, is in actual fact very important. Because if you go back to 2010 and the passing of the Control of Dogs Act, it was done with best intentions. This is not a new issue. It's come up over the years, sadly, where people have had severe attacks. I mean, Jenny Mara, told of some of the incidents, particularly one where someone had lost their life. So with that in mind, that was why the 2010 Act was introduced, in order to try and protect the public and to bring dangerous dogs under control. So from that point of view, the work of the Audit Committee in reviewing the legislation and establishing whether that has achieved its purpose is very important for the Parliament. And in actual fact, first of all, when you look at the statistics underpinning the story and the work of the committee, it clearly shows that the extent of the problem is much greater now than it was over 20 years ago. I absolutely accept that there's probably more data collected now than 20 years ago, but if you compare 2005, 2006, where the NHS recorded 363 attacks as a result of dog attacks compared to 2018-19. In Argyll and Clyde alone, there were 1,417 attacks. 255 of those were involving children, and in Lanarkshire 912, and in Ayrshire 439. So the extent of the problem, clearly has grown in that time, and that is what has led the committee to come to a conclusion that dog control legislation is not fit for purpose, because we're still seeing these level attacks, and we're still seeing some very high profile cases. Part of the reason for that is the lack of awareness around the legislation, not just with dog owners, but also among the Minister sort of touched on this in her contribution, but also among the agencies involved, Police Scotland, councils and the NHS. Clearly, dog control legislation places quite an onus on councils, and as I say, there's been a lack of awareness there in terms of what they're supposed to be carrying out. Without getting into a big debate around funding of councils, it's a fact that councils are finding great pressure in relation to their funding, and therefore finding the resources in order to adequately manage and control this legislation have clearly been a challenge for some councils. And I think in addition to that, the committee found that the law in itself, actually needs reformed, and I welcome, some of the announcements the Minister's made in relation to review. I think also if you listen to the hard evidence from some of the people and organisations that the committee spoke to, I know CWU are in the gallery and had an event in the Parliament before this debate, but when they're telling you that 250 posties are attacked every year by dogs, that shows that there's a real problem there. And they highlight the fact that in the incidents that they're seeing, there's just a lack of prosecution. And as a result of that, they've had to take their own private prosecutions. And they emphasise the frustration they find in dealing with local authorities that they're not properly managing the issue. And that's reiterated by the Association of Dog Wardens. There's supposed to be one person in each local authority who's responsible for administering the whole issue around attacks on dogs, and they're finding that that is not the case in a lot of local authorities, and the approach has been inconsistent and patchy. So I think the recommendations that the committee make are serious ones. First of all, around a dog control database. That would help identify instances of attacks and also instances of dogs that have got out of control. I think the whole issue of statistics and data is an important one in two regards. First of all, in terms of supplying evidence to demonstrate the effectiveness of legislation and any changes that are made, but also in demonstrating the extent of the issue. I think, as Bill Bowman was talking of in his contribution, I think it's also important that there's a greater deal of working together between the NHS, local authorities and Police Scotland in terms of not just in terms of administering the legislation, but also in collection of data. I think the whole issue of awareness is clearly a real problem across the board. Although, as a number of people in the debate have highlighted, the vast majority of dog owners are responsible. Unfortunately, there are instances where people's dogs get out of control, and the owners, aren't aware of that and aren't aware of the legislation. I actually see it myself in my local area. I do quite a lot of running, and I run around the local parks, and I find that the vast majority of dog owners will have their dog on a lead, or if they don't have their dog on a lead, they know the dog's not going to be disrupted by speedy jogger like me. But there are, even just over the course of this summer, I've had dogs, charge up and quite literally attack me, and that's, because the owners can't keep the dogs under control. So I think there's a lot to be done in terms of awareness. I think in summing up, Presiding Officer, I think what we have to remember as parliamentarians, we pass legislation to help people and to help our local communities. So the 2010 Act was passed in order to protect people who are potentially going to be subject to attacks by dogs, and to make sure that we've got proper prevention in place. This review has shown that the legislation overall is not fit for purpose, and I think it's important that the reviews that the Minister has instigated and the actions from the committee are taken forward. Not only that we get proper legislation, but we also are able to protect people in the communities we represent.
Thank you very much. And we now turn to the open part of the debate. I call Alec Neil to be followed by Donald Cameron. Alec Neil.
Very welcome. We're getting a cross-party consensus across the chamber on this subject as we did in 2010. Can I begin by congratulating the Radio Clyde network for the tremendous campaigning work they have done and their listeners have done in order to bring this subject to the fore of political attention in Scotland. I think there are two things in particular that we are all absolutely signed up to. The first one is that there is still a huge problem in Scotland arising from dogs who are out of control, not well bred, not well trained, and attacking people on a regular basis. And it's too big a problem to ignore. Although there isn't adequate quantification of the problem, an issue the committee has made recommendations about and how we sort that, we all know enough to know that this is a real problem affecting real people and in some cases, as the convener said, leading to fatality. It's an unacceptable situation that any Scottish Parliament must deal with and deal with effectively. Can I also say that we've got to be very clear about what we're talking about? When we started off the post-legislative scrutiny of the legislation, our main aim was to review the working of the 2010 Act, which is actually based on civil rather than criminal law. But as the convener outlined, we then moved on to a wider remit of looking at all the dog legislation, including the 1991 legislation, which was based on criminal law. But there are also other laws that haven't been mentioned specifically so far in the debate. And that relates to, for example, some of the legislation goes way back to the 19th century. And clearly what we need is a comprehensive, all-embracing review, and what I would like to see the outcome of that being is one codified act dealing with all aspects of dog control, both preventive and after the fact, covering both civil and criminal offences. For the law to work, it needs to be simple, well understood, easily referenced by the practitioners of law enforcement, and easy for the public to know what their rights are and to be well informed about those rights. That's a lot easier if you have one act instead of a multitude of acts to deal with. No doubt Stuart, I'm going to let him in, is going to tell me about the debate in the 19th century.
Stuart Stevenson.
Well, Stuart is just going to gently suggest that actually the problem is not dogs. And we keep talking about dogs when the problem is actually a human problem. And perhaps the new bill should be called the Control of Humans Who Own Dogs Bill.
Well, that'll be a very popular measure. Can I say I actually think it's both? I think a lot of the problems of dogs are that they are ill-bred, not trained properly, and probably, if we had the information and the data, it would probably show that that's the biggest problem. But it's like humans. Sometimes, for whatever reason, something in the blood or whatever, you also get rogue dogs, no matter how well trained, no matter how well brought up, can still be offensive and cause harm to individuals and indeed to other animals. Because as Emma Harper has pointed out in her legislative proposals, the harm that some dogs do to other species is also important and shouldn't be totally ignored. Of course.
Alex Rowley.
Like Neil for giving way. I noticed there was a debate this morning taking place on the Key Adams programme on the BBC, and many people were making the point Stuart Stevenson makes about it's not necessarily bad dogs, it's people that can't look after them. But one of the consensuses that seemed to keep coming across was that you should need a licence to have a dog, and without a licence you can't have a dog. What's your thoughts on that?
Alex Neil.
I was coming to that, but since I've been asked the question directly by Alec Rowley, let me say that we haven't been able to study this in detail, but we do know there are modern licensing systems, not the old 37.5p licence that most people were able to ignore before it was formally abolished, but a modern licensing system. And the two examples quoted to us have been in Northern Ireland, I think it was, and in Sweden. And I do think, whether you call it a licensing system or whatever, but something along those lines is absolutely required. And I think there's an important principle here. And I believe this principle is applied in Sweden. And that is, let's call it a licensing system, although perhaps that's not the best description. But let's call it a licensing system for the purposes of this debate. The key point is, well, there are two key points. Number one, you avoid the problem we've had with the legislation we passed, and that has been the abject lack of enforceability, particularly at local level. And we need to avoid that. There's no point in passing legislation if it isn't properly implemented. And whatever we do, we need to make sure that in future, the legislation we pass in this matter is properly implemented. But in order for that to happen, and to avoid a situation that's already been mentioned in the debate, where cuts have affected, this is an easy cut to make, get rid of dog wardens and all the rest of it. And I think the key point is of a modern licensing system that the revenue raised from that should be ring-fenced to fund and should be sufficiently high to fund a proper dog control, dog warden system so that we have enforceability. And I have many other ideas, but I now have to bring my remarks to an end. Thank you.
I call Donald Cameron to be followed by Christine Graham.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I greatly welcome the opportunity to contribute to this important debate. And I concur with many things that have said, especially Bill Bowman's comments when he opened for these benches. And we as a party wholeheartedly support the findings of the report and commend the committee on its work on this matter. Can I also pay tribute to Alec Neil, MSP, for raising this issue last year. I think I'm right in saying that was instrumental in bringing this issue back to the fore in our domestic politics. And I think he also called for the post-legislative review, which has now come to fruition. Without wanting to patronise one of Scotland's most experienced parliamentarians, it truly highlights, in my view, the value and importance of any backbench MSP to ask searching questions and, where appropriate, raise the profile of an issue so that we can collectively take action. I must confess that I'm not yet a dog owner, although I'm considering becoming one soon, but my practical knowledge is somewhat limited. I do have young children, and I always get a bit nervous when a strange dog walks into the house for no reason apart from the fact that there is a vulnerability there. But given that around 470,000, that's almost 500,000 homeowners in Scotland own a dog, it's about a fifth of the population, it's equally clear that dogs are highly valued as pets, with many people across Scotland caring for them as a pet. And it's also important, however, to recognise those instances where there are dogs that are not appropriate as pets or dogs that are not properly controlled. Like many across this chamber, I've been horrified at some of the stories about uncontrolled dogs and about the untold damage they can cause to individuals. And many will have seen the story of a week or so ago of Elaine Stanley from Widnes in Cheshire, who was mauled to death in her own home by 2 out-of-control dogs. It was a timely and horrific reminder that while dogs may be considered man or woman's best friend, they are also animals that we will never fully understand. And indeed, the committee's report lays bare the stark reality of the impact that a dog attack can have on the individuals affected and their family and friends, and sometimes other animals that are attacked too. And one submission in the report that stood out to me was that of Victim Support Scotland, who noted the case of a young child that survived an attack and required surgery. And that person now has, perhaps understandably, a fear of public spaces and a distrust in animals. And in the Highlands and Islands, there was an incident at the beginning of August where a 6-year-old in Inverness was left with serious facial injuries after an uncontrolled attack inside a house. These are all stark reminders about why dog ownership carries a degree of personal responsibility on the part of the adults who own them, and why particular breeds of dogs may not be right for a family environment. And of course, no legislation can completely prevent a freak and often tragic incident from happening. It is clear that there is something deeply wrong when, according to Dr. Alistair Caulfield's submission, an estimated 5,000 individuals are affected across Scotland each year by dog attacks. And the charity Battersea says that media reports indicate that dog bites have gone up in some cases by 80% since the Act came into force. Now, those of us who regularly leaflet in our constituencies and regions in a political context will know all too well the moment that we put a leaflet through the letterbox and the sudden force of a large dog is felt on the other side of the door. Indeed, this is a common occurrence for postal workers, and I noted the evidence presented by the Communication Workers Union that since 2010, 2,500 postal workers have been attacked by dogs. And I know, and I learned today, that some of those workers are present today, and can I fully endorse the comments of Jenny Mara in this regard. Can also say I was struck by the point made about data, that there's a lack of data that hindered the committee, and that was exacerbated by a failure to establish a database. And I really hope the government do look at that. We do have some data, as has been said, despite the significant number of attacks. The evidence points to the fact that charges under the 1991 Act have fallen each year since 2016, and the number of prosecutions sits at 82, just 82 for the most recent year. So it's clear that there are wide-ranging issues with that Act, and this is confirmed in the report. With both the 1991 Act and the 2010 Act. And the report states that current dog control law is not fit for purpose, and that had it been so, there should have been a corresponding reduction in prosecutions and in the number of individuals requiring treatment. And that clearly hasn't happened. And I was very struck by the phrase, a national crisis, which I think appears in the report. And I know many of the members, the MSPs on the committee, none of them are prone to hyperbole. And therefore, I was incredibly struck by their sense that there is a national crisis. And I think we must take that at face value. A number of recommendations have been made, and I urge the government to look at them and to take action. It's a wide-ranging report and is a clear example of why even the best intended legislation, Deputy Presiding Officer, still requires ongoing scrutiny to measure its efficacy and its impact. And the evidence in the report suggests that with adjustments, the Act can begin to work to reduce instances of dog attacks and admissions to hospital, and as a consequence, reduce prosecutions. And it should be properly implemented, to use Alec Neil's phrase. And I too was very struck by his view that we need a comprehensive piece of legislation covering both the criminal and the civil sphere. I think there's a lot to be said for that. And with that, Presiding Officer, can I close my comments?
Christine Graham, followed by Anna Sarwar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let me first thank the convener of the Audit Committee for giving me the opportunity to ask questions of the Minister when she came before the committee. But before I move on to comment on the inquiry, which I welcome as the members who took forward the bill, which I inherited from my adjacent colleague, Alec Neil, who was elevated to better things, let me preface my remarks by saying I have huge sympathy for all victims of dog attacks. But let's put the blame where the blame lies, with the owners of the dogs. Let me also say that press reports even today have commented that we're discussing dangerous dogs, which of course was not the original focus of the inquiry, because the whole point of the Control of Dogs Act was to prevent a dog becoming dangerous. I even noted that James Kelly referred to bringing dangerous dogs under control, which was not the point. Once a dog is dangerous, this Control of Dogs Act would not apply. And the thrust of the Control of Dogs Act was rightly to blame the deed, as I've said, the owner, not the breed. So perhaps it's time we ditched the sobriquet dangerous dogs and substituted reckless and feckless owners. As a member who navigated the bill through its various stages, I confess, as you can hear, I'm very protective of my legislative child, but I would happily concede its flaws had it been given the same chance to prove its worth as government legislation. This was not, and is still not, the case. Indeed, let me say by way of an aside that this legislation, the Control of Dogs Act, applies to private places for the postman, the care worker, somebody coming up the garden path, whether welcomed or uninvited, which does not occur in England, and yet most attacks take place on private land. Anyway, back to the point about publicity. This was addressed by the committee, but not by the government. And how can the public, let alone the professionals, know the law if they don't know what it is? The whole thing about a member's bill to date has been that once the member has steered it through the committees and it's made law, that's an end. It doesn't get any publicity from the government. And yet, the government has the power, because the Procedures Committee has said to me, once a bill is passed, it becomes the responsibility of the Scottish Government to implement its provisions, including publicity, where appropriate. Now, I don't know any member's bill that has been given publicity post-enactment. So, in a sense, this bill was not given fair when the funding wasn't there for dog wardens, the training wasn't there, and the publicity wasn't there for the public. If you ask the public outside, have you heard of the Control of Dogs Act? I'll bet you get the answer, what? If you've heard of the Dangerous Dogs Act, they might just have heard of that, and they think they're both one and the same thing. And the Control of Dogs Act also applied to a dog attacking other animals, putting it into fear and anxiety. So it was already there. Yes, it has flaws, but I think if it had been given a fairer chance, those flaws might not have been so great. So we have that. We also don't have a national database. So that's another important aspect, because somebody could move with their dog to another area and the data would be lost. And the nature of that data is important, because sometimes dog wardens didn't issue a dog control notice, but had a wee word in the ear of the owner, a shot across their bows to say, your dog's been reported, well, watch out now, you have to do these things. If you don't, I'll issue a dog control notice on you, the owner. It also meant if you handed your dog over to somebody else to take care of and take out for a walk, you're still responsible, because you've given that duty over to somebody else. Doesn't mean that you no longer have responsibility. So these things have sort of prevented what I think was reasonably decent legislation from the start. So we're now moving towards a national database. Like the convener, I really don't know quite why we're consulting. I don't know why we're not just getting on with the technicalities of it, because we know all dogs are microchipped. Yes, Minister.
Ash Denham.
Thank you. The 2010 Act actually places a statutory duty on the government to consult. So we're not able to just move ahead and bring in the database. We must consult on it. So that's why we're doing the consultation.
Well,
Christine Graham.
Thank you. I'll pick you up, Nancy. Well, consult the technicalities, not whether there should be one or there shouldn't be one. I would ask you just to consult the technicalities. So I'm now going to move on, because I'm moving on with another bill, responsible dog ownership, because the problem starts from the moment somebody acquires a puppy. They acquire it spontaneously, they may do an impulse, they see it on the internet, they buy it in Gumtree, they don't think about all their duties that are involved in it. And in this I will tackle Alec Rousey's idea of a licence. The trouble with a licence is, in Northern Ireland, there's only 40% uptake. My bill will place duties on somebody acquiring a puppy or a dog will imply that you then have a licence, implies it. So that if you breach those duties, either through the welfare or behaviour of that dog, then you have no longer will be entitled to have a dog, or you will be put on notice about it. So in that way, 100% of people who have and acquire, not purchase, but acquire, that's in case somebody tries to get round the law, we're saying I didn't buy it, who acquires a puppy or dog after a certain date will be deemed to be licensed to have that dog because they've gone through these tests. I know it's a strange thing to do, maybe it won't work, but I think it's worth the effort. So I wish my old bill well, and I hope it's amended to make it a fit for purpose. I think it's pretty well is. And I hope my new bill, if it's successful, is promoted by the government and gets the publicity that all members' bills deserve. Thank you.
Anna Sarwar, followed by Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Deputy Presiding Officer, I came to this debate at the committee as someone who wasn't a member when the legislation was passed in 2010, and I wasn't part of the committee when it first started taking its consideration, so genuinely with a neutral perspective. My only experience or opinion was framed around probably the experience of most political activists around their own experiences walking up driveways, trying to put their hands through a letterbox to deliver leaflets, and what risks may lay behind certain doors. I know, for example, a councillor in my area who's had a finger bitten off. I know of several elected members across all different political parties who have had negative interactions with a dog. And I can recall from one of my own campaigning experiences, chapping on a door, getting no answer, hearing a dog coming from behind, biting me square on the leg, the owner coming out, picking up the dog, apologising profusely, asking me which political party I was from. I said the Labour Party. She put the dog back down again and it bit me again. So that's probably the length short of my experience with dogs. But there's a serious point. And the serious point is the tragic circumstances and stories we heard at the committee from individuals who have children who either lost a life due to an adverse incident with a dog or a tragic incident with a dog, or several children who were left with permanent disfigurations and perhaps in their face because of an attack by a dog. And it made me reflect as a parent about the risks to my own children. I know from experience, for example, at the local park, where you have a gated area, which is clearly only supposed to be for children and for parents. Clearly no dog should be anywhere near that gated area. On one particular occasion, a stray dog coming into that gated area whenever a gate was opened by a child, the dog coming in, jumping on each of the rides right in the face of the children. Luckily no actual attack or bite, but you can see from the impact it had on the children and the parents of the children that even though that might not leave a permanent disfiguration in terms of any kind of bite, that will be trauma for a child, psychological trauma for a child, that may well be a psychological trauma for the rest of their life. And there was no way that the owner of that dog was in any way in control of that dog. And that's probably an experience for hundreds of individuals most days right across our country. So looking at it from that perspective as a parent and also someone that's out round the doors. And therefore I can share the concerns of the postal workers at the CWU who are at the coalface in terms of the challenges. The CWU reporting that 250 postal workers attacked in Scotland by a dog each year. As the convener of the committee said, Jenny Mara said, if that was 250 attacks by a human being or human beings on postal workers each year, we would have much more direct action and intervention, I'm sure, from this Parliament and indeed from our police authorities. I also think about the impact it has on our National Health Service. And just some statistics from Glasgow and Clyde itself from 2018 to 2019, A&E's 1,417 presentations at A&E with a dog-related injury in a single year. 1,417, 255 of them on a child. Simply not acceptable. 912 in NHS Lanarkshire, 439 in NHS Ayrshire. And at the same time, we have local authorities who are supposed to be enacting a lot of the legislation. The FOI of Glasgow City Council found that it had just one part-time dog warden that hadn't issued a single notice across a 3-year period from 2015 to 2018. Clearly, there is a sharp risk, but there is not the action taking place in local communities and local authorities across the country. And I want to emphasise the point made by Christine Graham in her contribution. I think there needs to be a serious discussion within this Parliament about legislation that comes from a member and legislation that comes from government, and how both are not treated as one and the same. This is still Scotland's Parliament. It is still a Parliament of, I would hope, equal. So if legislation is passed in this Parliament, I think incumbent on government, whichever political party that government is from, and whichever piece of legislation, no matter which member it comes from, regardless of political party, that legislation is supported in terms of financial support, it's supported in terms of its implementation across the country, and crucially it's supported in terms of getting the PR, the public relations out there, so that the public know that legislation exists to protect them. It cannot just be a case of a picking and choosing of what suits the government of individual day. And there is a challenge around local authority funding and the lack of local authority funding, and therefore this being seen as some kind of easy cut to make or not an investment to make. I was also struck by the inconsistency of the level of wardens in different parts of the country, how there is not really a data sharing. So if someone who is unable to control a dog lives in one local authority, when they move local authority, that information is not shared then with a neighbouring local authority, and the risk that might pose to any individual or family. I realise I'm short of time, Deputy Presiding Officer. What I would say in closing is I think the legislation is very well-meaning. I think we do have consensus in this Parliament that action does need to be taken, and we need to strengthen and enact the legislation properly. I think it's incumbent on all of us, the government, but also all of us on the opposition benches, to make sure we have a piece of legislation that is fit for purpose, that serves the communities that we represent, so that no child and no individual is put at risk across our communities.
Colin Beattie, followed by Emma Harper.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in this debate on the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee report on the Control of Dogs Act 2010. Dogs are reputed to be man's best friend, and for most of us that is indeed the case. They can be a companion and a friend, provide children with a beneficial experience, which undoubtedly improves their social responses. And most owners take regular exercise, as required by their four-legged friends, so we can claim them to be promoters of good health and well-being. To those who live alone, they're truly a best friend and a life enhancer. The vast majority of dog owners provide a loving and comfortable home for their best friend. But these are not the owners of the dogs which the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee have been focused on. As is the case all too often, it is the activity of the few which impacts on the many, and it is on this that the committee has of necessity concentrated. There is no doubt in my mind that a dog brought into an environment which is stressed and chaotic will in itself reflect that environment and will respond in an unpredictable manner. Dogs are clearly happiest in a home with a stable routine, with predictable behaviour which is understood. Another clear factor is that certain types of dogs are sometimes kept in inappropriate environments. For example, I'm aware of 2 huskies being homed in a 2-bedroom flat. Is that really the best home for large, active dogs? Surely these dogs will require considerable activity and space which is disproportionate to that available in their home. There are times when prospective owners need to take advice on the best type of dog for the spaces in which they will be kept. So the committee focused on instances of those dogs which have been identified as a problem. In my own constituency of Midlothian, North and Musselburgh, there are all too many dog attacks. I have constituents who have been maimed and seriously traumatised by dog attacks. I have constituents who have watched their small dogs being ripped apart by aggressive larger dogs. And only recently, 4 police officers were attacked by dogs and hospitalised. When you explore the details, you find there's all too many incidents. And in line with findings of the committee, many attacks are not reported. Where a family pet acts out of character and inflicts injury on a family member, there is a tendency not to report such attacks. And according to one nurse in my own local health centre, approximately 3 serious injuries inflicted by dogs are treated there every week. One of the biggest obstacles in getting to grips with this problem is the poor data, firstly due to underreporting, and secondly due to A&E not specifically reporting such injuries. But as near as can be ascertained from the information we have, there are around 5,000 serious dog attacks on people each year. My own belief is that this figure may be far less than the reality. Many of the injuries are sustained by children, and for many of them, these are life-changing, leaving permanent scars which are both physical and mental. The cost to the NHS of treating such injuries, including the ongoing plastic surgery, is not quantified, but must be considerable. In taking evidence, the committee had heart-rending stories of the results of such incidents, including the Communication Workers Union, whose pictures of injured postal workers were both graphic and telling. At this level of injury, the committee report described the situation as a national crisis, and I can only agree with that assessment. We cannot endorse a situation where thousands of our citizens are attacked and maimed every year without taking urgent action to reduce and eliminate the problem. Frankly, it's not easy. Draconian measures will clearly impact on the vast majority of sensible and responsible dog owners. The scale of the problem is industrial. There are simple and effective measures which could be taken and which have been suggested in the committee report, and I'm grateful that the Scottish Government is giving these serious attention. An obvious concern is dog control notices. The use of them has reduced as council resources have diminished. I believe the DCN process is flawed. When a DCN is issued, neighbours and complainants may be aware of the issuance of the DCN, but are deliberately not made aware of the content. Dog wardens are few and far between, and the chance of them becoming aware of the breaching of the terms of a DCN are slim. Reliance must be placed on those most affected. Neighbours should police this and report such breaches, but this will not happen if they do not know the content of the DCN. The committee had great concerns over this, and I believe that action needs to be taken to change this process. After all, when an ASBO is issued, neighbours are made aware of the terms. Why not a DCN? Self-policing makes sense. Locally, I've found that the police and council have poor understanding of who should deal with what type of dog attack should be reported how. Members of the public have been reporting everything to their council, which were only taking note of those attacks which fell under their remit. This situation was confirmed by Police Scotland, who accepted that sometimes the system was not joined up. I welcome their undertaking to the committee to take action on this shortcoming and look towards a better process going forward. Currently, if an owner has a problem dog for whatever reason, then the only ultimate recourse for the council is an expensive court case to deal with this, and that severely reduces the number of dogs falling into this category being dealt with properly. The suggestion has been made that reintroducing dog licences would be beneficial. This would mean that councils would not need to have recourse to the courts, but be able to suspend or withdraw an owner's right to keep a dog. This has many attractions, since the test will be that of a fit and proper person, and complaints from neighbours and those who have been attacked will undoubtedly influence the council committee considering the case, as will input from police and dog wardens. It has the appearance of simplicity and the advantage that decent dog owners are left in peace and not subjected to more restrictive or onerous regulations. The downside in that would be the cost involved in setting up the national database, but the fee for the dog licences would hopefully cover that and the administrative costs. Presiding Officer, it's clear that a great deal of work needs to be done to ensure the safety of the public and the safety of our family pets. I believe that this report by the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee is a step in the right direction and that it highlights a problem which needs to be addressed urgently. And I commend the report to Parliament and thank the committee clerks and the others for their tenacity in producing this report.
Emma Harper, followed by Maurice Corey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak about the control of dogs in this important debate. Although I'm not a member of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee, I am really interested in the committee's review of the Control of Dogs 2010 legislation, and I agree with many of the asks in the report. I feel there are several issues worth highlighting. The issue of control of dogs is one that I am also seeking to address in my current proposed Protection of Livestock Scotland Bill, for which the public consultation has concluded, and the bill is currently being drafted, and I thank Alec for actually bringing this up. I'll therefore focus my time on attacks on livestock by out-of-control dogs and the impact this has on farmers and their families. That's something that the committee's report actually touches on, but maybe doesn't go into a lot of detail. Presiding Officer, almost 3 million acres of our land in Scotland is used for common grazing by livestock, and folk have a right to roam. We have 1.8 million cattle, 6.83 million sheep. We've got evidence that sheep has been shown to be most at risk from out-of-control dog attacks. We've got 333,000 pigs, 14.11 million poultry, and 1,350 horses for agricultural use, and about 1,200 alpacas and llamas, and 7,000 farm deer. That's a lot of beasts that we have on our grazing land. And while the sector is working hard to rear and look after and protect their livestock, the truth is that the current law does not adequately protect the people or the livestock from attack by out-of-control dogs in the countryside. Indeed, year on year for the past 10 years, my research has seen the number of livestock attacks steadily increase. For example, in 2014-15, the number of offences recorded in Scotland under the Dogs Protection of Livestock Act 1953 was 109, whereas the number in 2017-18 had risen to 170. This isn't even talking about the around 50% of incidences which are estimated that are not even reported or recorded. In coming up with a solution to address this issue, we must first understand why dog attack numbers are increasing. The reason for this might be the vast growth over the past 5 years in the number of dogs being kept as pets across the UK. In 2013, it was estimated that across the UK there are 8 million dogs as pets. However, by 2018, this number had increased by about 500,000, which is the current estimated number of dogs in Scotland. I have 2 collies myself, Presiding Officer. With increasing numbers of people across our society owning dogs, there are of course going to be households acquiring dogs, whether through purchase or adoption, without the ability to train and responsibly look after their animals, which is where we see problems beginning to arise. It has been put to me by many farmers, agricultural organisations and others that the only way to bring about a reduction in livestock attack numbers is to have a fit-for-purpose bill to consolidate current livestock legislation, meaning the 2010 and 1953 legislation, and show that the severity of this 66-year-old legislation has consequences, and that dogs attacking livestock is not something that anybody can accept in our current 2019. Some, including in this chamber, have suggested that livestock worrying be part of a government consolidated legislation. However, it is my view, and the view of Scotland's agricultural sector, that the issue is so critically important that it deserves its own bill. A bill that farmers can get behind, and a bill that shows clearly the severity of the consequences that will apply if dogs are allowed to worry livestock, and a bill which can be delivered in a timely manner in this parliamentary session. The view from Scotland's agricultural community in relation to out-of-control dogs in the countryside is clear. It is expressed in paragraph 88 of the committee's report, as well as in vast number of responses to my own consultation, where it is noted from various agricultural organisations, including the National Farmers Union, Scottish Land and Estates and the National Sheep Association, that the number of livestock worrying incidents continues to remain far too high, and these organisations do not believe that the 2010 Act has been effective in reducing the number of out-of-control dogs in the countryside. For example, the 2010 Act states that dogs must not cause apprehension to other animals. However, recent views and evidence show that this is inadequate, and the severity of the offence is diminished, as most incidences have involved the physical attack of livestock, as well as psychological trauma, abortion of lambs and damage and distress. Presiding Officer, while I agree that any attack on a person from an out-of-control dog is extremely traumatic for any person or child or parent, I know this as I've been an operating room nurse myself that has assisted surgeons in repairing damage caused to torn tissue. It is important, though, to acknowledge that attacks on livestock are also traumatic for farmers. I point to one experience of a farmer in Argyll and Bute who reported in my consultation that he went to his field to find 14 sheep who had been mauled and mutilated by multiple dogs. This had profound implications for his own mental health and that of his family. It is traumatic for all. While there is a lot more I could say this afternoon, I simply don't have enough time, Presiding Officer. So, in conclusion, I welcome the committee report. I thank all who contributed to it, and it's good to have an opportunity to discuss it today. I acknowledge and thank the Scottish Partnership for Rural Crime for their work in raising awareness of the issue of livestock worrying, included attending all of Scotland's agricultural shows this year to deliver outreach education. And finally, I thank the clerks to the committee and everyone who contributed again to this report, and I look forward to the Government's response.
Maurice Corrie, followed by Willie Coffey.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I join my colleagues today in welcoming the insightful work of the committee into the 2010 Control of Dogs Scotland Act. The committee's recommendations have incorporated expert opinion along with personal experience in an effort to present the most necessary and compelling improvements which should be made. And I must say at this point I concur with Anna Sarwar's experience on the election trail, where once I was out when my wife was helping me, and I turned in the street to find my wife holding a Jack Russell up with his teeth through a finger. But I'm glad to say I did get the vote, which was good. The aim behind the 2010 Act was to modernise how legislation works in relation to the control of dogs in Scotland. It's aimed at redefining when a dog is out of control and to offer a more effective model, aimed at reducing the risk of dog attacks with more responsible dog ownership. And there's certainly been many wise words spoken this afternoon on this particular part of the debate. Importantly, we need to remember that this Act was to supplement provisions made in the existing legislation, such as the Dangerous Dogs Act of 1991, and not standing alone. Yet we have heard that despite intentions of the 2010 Act, injuries related to dog attacks appeared to be on the rise. And after reading the committee's report, this increase can be linked with confusion surrounding enforcement and responsibilities and a lack of centralized data collection and prevention measures. We cannot ignore the impact dog attacks have and can have on a person's life. Indeed, this report has laid bare the seriousness of many dog attack cases, and life-changing injuries with permanent scarring can limit someone's physical ability and even hamper their employment opportunities and indeed their mental capacity. In particular, we have to recognise the special risks to children. And being of a lighter weight and closer to the ground, children who endure dog attacks can more likely be to suffer facial injuries with often longer-lasting physical and mental scarring. And to read of children who have suffered worsening anxieties and distress in animals as a result of their experience is surely enough to move us to enacting these recommendations. This sobering research has opened wide the gaps in legislation where it needs to offer greater clarity. And for one, it is essential that a database is in place. We cannot understand the true scale of dog attacks without the collection of clear and consistent statistics. And as the committee has suggested, local authorities, the police service and hospitals need to collate data of these instances, both attacks on human and animals, and in particular farm animals, as Emma Harper has so clearly highlighted this evening, and how these figures can relate to the number of dog control notices issued. If this recommendation was to be adopted, it would rightly remove the burden placed on victims and the public to report any breaches of notices. What is troubling is that this information in the form of the Scottish Dog Control Database could have been available already if implemented in 2011. And without a functioning database, we cannot recognise with accuracy the extent of the problem and where resources need to be directed. A key objective of the Act centred around the prevention of dog attacks. It aimed to tackle out-of-control dogs before they reached the stage of dangerous and threatening behaviour. But with figures from the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal, it shows that ongoing cases of dog attacks equating to at least one attack in Scotland every day, it is abundantly clear that measures favouring early intervention have not been established. There is also the question of responsibility. Weak clarity surrounding which roles cover which responsibilities in implementation limits its potential. And the Scottish Government has created a joint protocol document to attempt to address the roles and responsibilities of police and local authorities. Yet even with this document, we still see confusion and inconsistency over when a case should be referred to and to who it should be referred. At the core of this issue is a confusion over which act is to be followed, and this has already been highlighted today, the 2010 Act or the 1991 Dangerous Dogs Act. The Scottish Government needs to ensure that police officers and the local authorities are equipped with the right information in dealing with dog attacks, and it is this critical way in which the Act can go some way to reach its full potential. Therefore, for the legislation to be at its most effective, which was intended, the Scottish Government must push for further awareness on how it is meant to be enforced. And to promote responsible dog ownership and effective dog control, police officers and local authorities would be able to operate more effectively with increased training to better understand their responsibilities. As well as enforcers, members of the public would benefit from an awareness campaign centring on dog control legislation, as the committee recommends, and it would be beneficial to have detail on how soon this campaign can be started, and maybe the Minister will tell us this later on, especially in our local schools for the benefit of children. Indeed, no legislation can be truly successful without public awareness of what it involves. And in conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, the seriousness of dog attacks must inform our dog control legislation. Rather than complacency, our communities will benefit from updated, effective and modernised dog control legislation which favours awareness and prevention. And for this to be realised, the recommendations put forward by the committee need to be implemented without delay to keep our communities safe. Thank you.
Willie Coffey, followed by Alec.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. This is a really important debate, and you can tell by the strength of feeling shown by the members so far how much they care about this issue. I'd also like to add my thanks to our committee clerking team for putting this substantial report together that is allowing such an informed debate to take place, and to recognise how difficult it must have been, particularly with some of the harrowing evidence that we heard along the way. And to also thank our Minister for the comprehensive reply, who clearly demonstrated her commitment to consider and act on the committee's concerns. I joined the committee too not long after the inquiry began, and I heard some of that evidence from some who were attacked themselves and some whose family members have been attacked and killed by dogs. The accounts described were harrowing. The impact that dog attacks have on victims, particularly in children, can be life-changing. So we understand the pain that affected families have been through. The evidence that the committee heard suggests that there is still an unacceptably high number of dog attacks in Scotland. Since the 2010 Act came into force, the evidence shows there has not been a reduction in the number of attacks. We heard some harrowing evidence from Veronica Lynch, whose daughter was killed by a Rottweiler in 1989. Veronica reminded us that legislation alone won't stop dog attacks, and that we need a more holistic approach to this, involving owners, better education of owners and training of dogs, basically interventions at the earliest stage possible that might help prevent at least some of these attacks occurring. The committee also heard from Dave Joyce, I think the convener, and one or two other members mentioned this, from the National Health and Safety Officer from the Communications Workers Union. In his evidence, Mr Joyce described a situation where our postal workers are on the front line when it comes to irresponsible dog owners with their out-of-control dogs. Every year, 250 postmen and women in Scotland are attacked by dogs. Some of those attacks are so serious physically and mentally that the victim can't continue in their job. Mr Joyce also told us that 8 out of every 10 attacks on postal workers take place between the garden gate or entrance and the front door of the house. Now, I've had the privilege of being a postman during my student days, Presiding Officer, and went back out again not too long ago to work in a local run in Kilmarnock. It's amazing that some dog owners just don't seem to think to keep their dogs away from the garden when a postman or woman or anybody else is likely to be calling around. Surely we can help reduce attacks by communicating with and seeking the help of the public, letting them know when the post will be delivered. It seems such a simple idea. To ask the owners to think and please take steps to secure their dogs in that period, not just for the postal workers, of course, but for any visitors coming to a house. Just think about safety and make sure your visitors are safe. Seems such a simple idea that I hope we can take up and do something about. The issue that was mentioned a few times and also mentioned by the Minister, this notion of a reasonable apprehension that came up earlier, I think that really took the members of the committee by surprise. Under the 1991 Act, it was explained to us that in order for a case to be successfully prosecuted, it's necessary to prove that there was a reasonable apprehension that a dog would bite someone. And that's what's led to this notion or this perception that a one free bite rule exists. The committee, I think it's fair to say, felt that this test has to go, or at least should not be the first test applied. The severity of the attack should be the determinant of what action should follow with regard to the dog and the owner. And from memory, I'm fairly sure the Minister recognised this concern at the committee and in her remarks is taking this on board. It wasn't all bad, Presiding Officer. We had some really helpful evidence from East Ayrshire, from Billy Gilchrist in my local council, East Ayrshire. Mr Gilchrist described examples of good practice, with that council working closely with Police Scotland and the Crown Office in relation to evidence gathering, serving of notices and reporting breaches of notice. The relationship seemed to be working quite well down there, and it provided an excellent level of information sharing, resulting in the effective use of the dog control notices. Now, looking ahead, as the evidence developed, I think the discussion at the committee started focusing in on what measures we could and should be looking at to assist with better and stronger implementation of the existing provisions. To prevent attacks and bites rather than dealing with the aftermath, how can we better influence behaviour before these attacks happen? Of course, awareness raising is one of them, and all the members have suggested some ideas about how to improve that. Resources and further training, perhaps, for dog wardens, not only to be aware of the legislation, but the help that they might need too, the training they might need to help them deal with dangerous dog behaviour. That may also help. Licensing schemes have been mentioned by a few members, not least to allow us to gather much of the data that we think we need to inform debate and the review that the government will carry out. And also for those who wish to deal with, who might wish to obstruct the dog control process. Hospitals and GPs too could help us by recording attacks by dogs when injured people present at our A&E surgeries. We don't think that they do that at the moment, and we hope that they might or they should do. And the police and local councils can help too by further gathering information that might help us to take this forward. Presiding Officer, I'm pleased at the committee's conclusion that the current dog control law is not fit for purpose will be taken forward by the government, and a full review of the current legislation will be carried out. Prevention is probably where most of the gains will be for us, but we do need to strengthen the legislation to make it clear to the minority of dog owners who cannot or will not control their dogs that we are willing to act to get this situation under control. Thank you.
Alec Crowley, followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Presiding Officer, the debate today on the committee report on post-legislative scrutiny of the Control of Dogs Act is of vital importance, and we've heard that from many speakers today. We as a Parliament have a duty to ensure that legislation works in regards to its intended purpose, and where it does not work for its intended purpose, it is appropriate that we attempt to fix it. This is especially important given the overall arching aim of the Act we are discussing today was to reduce the number of dog attacks in Scotland. The intention behind the 2010 Act to make an attempt at modernising the law on the control of dogs was well-meaning. But as with many things, it is the implementation that has raised concerns as opposed to the intention. Both the enforcement and the understanding of the law as it stands is far too limited, and without change the law is not being best used as a mechanism to help prevent attacks. It is clear that this needs to be changed, as the committee report states, and I quote, "There is still an unacceptable high prevalence of dog attacks in Scotland, and that numbers have not reduced since the provisions of the 2010 Act came into force. Certain evidence points to an increase in dog attacks. Given the volume of such attacks and the impact on victims, particularly on children, can be life-changing, the committee considers it is nothing less than a national crisis. And that's why we need to see action on this sooner rather than later. In addition, the committee statement, the ongoing Lead the Way campaign that has been run by Clyde News has highlighted figures which show thousands of kids are being attacked and left with life-changing injuries in Scotland every year. On top of this, there has only been 42 convictions under the current laws in the last 8 years, despite the introduction of the legislation in 2010. This is why the committee report into post-legislative scrutiny of the Act and its recommendations are both welcome and necessary. The Act has created an administrative regime intended to influence the behaviour of dog owners and those in charge of dogs. Local authorities were given powers to issue dog control notices on the owner or person in charge of a dog, which they have failed to keep under control. However, what happened was that the law led to an increased financial burden on local authorities and their staff over a period in which council budgets have been slashed with no resources available to respond to the legislation. It is clear that appointing an insufficient number of dog wardens has negatively impacted on local authorities' ability to implement the 2010 Act and the effectiveness of the Act in reducing the number of out-of-control dogs. But this is not the fault of the local authorities, but a failure of adequate funding of local government. What is needed, and this applies to many of the well-intended policies of the Scottish Government, is resources. It is all well and good having good intentions, but unless they can be implemented, then those intentions are not fit for purpose. If the intention is to deliver legislation which properly attempts to reduce dog attacks, then the government should reform the law and properly resource enforcement so that out-of-control and dangerous dogs can be dealt with properly. Indeed, the committee report states, and I quote, "The committee believes that the current dog control law is not fit for purpose and calls on the Scottish Government to undertake a comprehensive review of all dog control legislation as a matter of urgency." Proper resourcing and reviews aside, there are actions that can be taken now. The committee report indicates that one of the key reasons hampering the effectiveness of the 2010 Act is the absence of the Scottish Dog Control Notice database, which Scottish ministers have had the power to establish since the Act came into force in 2011 and have not yet to date done so. Why has this not been done? This is a move supported by the Kennel Club and indeed my esteemed colleague Alec Neil, who had a members' business debate on dog attacks last year and has also said that a national database should have been created a long time ago to track dangerous dogs when they move from one area to another. Hopefully, by scrutinising this Act and by listening to the body of evidence provided to the committee, we can begin to take the necessary steps to better implement policy regarding the control of dogs. And we will know if this is effective only when we see a reduction in the numbers of attacks. This can't come soon enough, as I am sure we will all agree. Even one attack is one too many, so we need the government to act. Thank you.
The last of the open debate contributions is from Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and let me congratulate the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee for the substantial work they've done in producing this report. The very fact we now have a committee that has post-legislative in its title is, I think, a very welcome move forward, because historically we've mumped and moaned on the back benches, the front benches, and quite generally about a lack of scrutiny of legislation. Today sets a pretty high benchmark for what we now might see in future. One of the things I would say is I'm reminded by this whole process how things change and how they don't, because this in post-legislative scrutiny stands in a very important place. Firstly, all but the member in charge of the bill at stage 3 have departed this Parliament, so there's only one left. Well done, Christine Graham. She truly is the last person standing. I congratulate her. Now, of course, when the bill came forward, it was well-intentioned and widely supported, albeit the Cabinet Secretary, in referring to the power of the database in Section 8, showed a marked lack of enthusiasm in his contribution on the 22nd of April 2010. But the report puts things in a different place. The intention that there was in 2010 is clearly as important today as it was then. Its implementation has been hobbled by our not seeing bits of it picked up. The report details in painful detail that lacuna exists. It proffers no real insight into why so little action flowed from Ms Graham and others 3 years of hard work to get the bill over the finishing line and onto the statute book. The Cabinet Secretary in the debate specifically said we have an enabling power, talking about Section 8, but are not persuaded that a database is either needed nor wanted, nor is the committee. But things move on, and I think despite that being the view in 2010, we must now regard that as unfinished business in relation to what we're talking about today. The 8 years since Royal Assent in March 2011 are perhaps too long. Now, my experience of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, otherwise the DPLR, which I served on for 1,283 days until March 2016, illustrate perhaps some of the ways we might better implement Parliament's Acts. It was a regular feature of the DPLR that we were saying to the government in relation to secondary legislation that there were errors in it. There might be small errors, there might be rather bigger errors. Frequently, what the government would say is that they would remedy the defects in the secondary legislation at the earliest opportunity. But in the real world, you saw that the earliest opportunity often proved to be elusively distant or even non-existent. So the committee agreed with my suggestion that we should record such commitments and publish our list of their commitments on a regular basis. If I recall correctly, it was quarterly. And that shone a light into a dusty corner of the legislative process. And you know what? Suddenly, these amendments that were promised started to happen because the committee was publishing the list of those that were outstanding, and it was in the government's interest to see the list shrink rather than continuing to grow. And perhaps in relation to legislation, it might be useful if we had a list of all the bits of legislation that have not yet been commenced. In this bill, it's all been commenced. In the 2009 Climate Change Act I was responsible for, there is a section that has not been commenced. Now, there is a good and proper reason why that's so, but nonetheless, it's not in the public domain until I discovered this morning that that had not been commenced. So I think if we were to do that, we might see that there'd be less likely that these important bits of legislation that we put forward don't simply disappear. The bill we're talking about hasn't been forgotten. It's actually been amended in 3 places, twice by the Courts Reform Scotland Act in 2014 and by the Police and Fire Reform Act of 2012. So it hasn't been forgotten about, it's just it hasn't been fully implemented. Now, like others, I have been engaged by dogs when I'd rather they hadn't. I've indeed been sitting on 4 fang marks from a leafleting escapade throughout this debate. I can't exhibit them to you for rather obvious reasons. In the Falkirk West by-election in 2000, I shoved a leaflet through a door in Falkirk, and a dog collected the leaflet and my hand as part of the process. The scar is here, 6 stitches. Mr. and Mrs. Reid, who were the householders, kindly let me wash the wound. It turned out that the dog was called Oliver, so I'm the only politician to have a scar from being bitten by Oliver Reid. Now, the issue about out-of-control dogs or out-of-control humans. In the United States, dog fighting is a big issue, and they've routinely been destroying hundreds of dogs involved in that. But there's now people take these dog-fighting dogs, rehabilitate them, in most cases successfully, and put them into homes where they have happy lives. If that doesn't prove that the problem is the owners and not the dogs, I don't know what does. Presiding Officer.
We now move to the closing speeches. And first of all, James Kelly, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think it's been a very interesting debate. You know, as I said in my initial contribution, the committee under Jenny Marr's stewardship have done an excellent job in setting the scene around the post-legislative reform, around control of dogs, and as Alec Neil pointed out, it's broached out into a much wider review. I think the interest that the debate has shown, the various contributions from around the chamber, shows a lot of interest in this area, but also very constructive in terms of practical solutions going forward, not just in terms of legislation, but in making the whole system work better to protect people from out-of-control dogs. I think, as Alec Neil said, this clearly is a real problem. You know, not just the growth in the number of attacks that the statistics show, but the number of instances that we see in our own local areas and local constituencies. And, you know, perhaps it's part of the reason, as Emma Harper pointed out, is the growth in the number of people owning dogs and growth in dogs as pets. But there's no doubt there's a real issue here, and we've got to do our work properly as parliamentarians in addressing it, because it's not just the issues around, as the committee heard, sadly, young children in some instances losing their life or being severely injured. It's also the psychological impact that Anas Sarwar pointed out in the example he gave, you know, where a dog, you know, can be roaming about a park, and young children can end up not just terrified at that minute, but could suffer psychological trauma as an effect. I think Christine Graham gave a very interesting overview as the member that brought forward the 2010 legislation. I think the key point that she made was that when a member's bill is passed, it's passed by the Parliament, but it doesn't come with all the kind of backing behind it in terms of profile and raising awareness that a government bill does. And that's been, you know, one of the shortcomings in raising awareness. And I think we would do well to bear that in mind, not just in terms of Christine Graham's legislation, but also members' bills in general. I think in terms of the law, clearly there are a number of points that have been made in relation to reviews that could be made. Jenny Mara made the point about the principle of one free bite basically being allowed because of the legal principle of reasonable apprehension. That seems unreasonable, and I think that's something that should be addressed as a matter of urgency. I think the other thing that really needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency is the implementation of the dog control database. I listened to the Minister's response to Christine Graham around the implementation of that, and that the legislation requires a consultation. I think that consultation has got to be expedited, basically, because if we don't have a proper dog control database in place in order to collect the data and to try and manage potentially out of control dogs, then we're not going to even start to get to the heart of the problem. A number of people touched on local authority funding, including Alec Rowley, who made the very reasonable point that if we're going to have proper legislation on this, then it needs to be not just administered by local authorities, but they need the funding to carry that through. And Colin Beattie, you know, kind of highlighted one of the consequences of that when he said that there'd only been 42 prosecutions. But part of that might be that local authorities were reluctant to take prosecutions forward because of the cost and because of other funding pressures. And that kind of led a number of people on to the discussion around licensing, and Alec Neil made a really strong case for licensing. I don't have a declared position around that, but I was quite open to the point Alec Neil was making, that if you had a licensing scheme and that therefore raised revenue that could fund the proper administration of you know, control of dogs, then that might overcome some of the other issues around council cuts and council pressures. The other point I would make is just around, you know, consistency of implementation from councils, and we heard from Maurice Corrie an example of how it was very patchy and how the implementation was inconsistent and not effective in his area. But we also heard a good example from Willie Coffey in relation to East Ayrshire. So that all needs to be tightened up on. I think in summing up, there's been a lot of really good points made in the debate. The overall point that I felt that Alec Rowley summed up well was that if we're going to pass legislation, we need to ensure it's fit for purpose. And in this area, not just in terms of the Control of Dogs Act, but in relation to not just legislation, but practice around control of dogs, the committee has highlighted a number of very important recommendations in areas which have been brought to the Chamber's attention this afternoon. And I think the Minister needs to outline a kind of more speedy plan to take that forward.
Finlay Carson, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. As a substitute member of the committee, I took part in the evidence sessions relating to this legislation. And given the plethora of possible new legislation relating to dog control and dog welfare, this is a debate that I've been following closely. The committee's report should herald an urgent change in order to protect people from horrific attacks, in addition to dog-related antisocial behaviour. There is nothing funny about dog attacks. And the shocking examples mentioned by Jenny Mara are evidence that our communities have all too often been blighted by dog attacks, highlighting the failure of current laws to be effective in tackling control of dogs who attack, whether that attack is against people or against other animals. As Christine Graham mentioned, the committee discussed how it worryingly appears that because the Act became about as a private member's bill, that the government completely took their eye off the ball and made little effort to ensure that the legislation was understood, or if it was, working in practice. Indeed, Alec Neil was right to highlight the government's complacency surrounding the bill in committee. I'm astonished at the lack of data collected over the 8 years since the Act came into force, because without data it's difficult to assess how effective, or otherwise in this case, the Control of Dogs Scotland Act 2010 has been in reducing the number of out-of-control dogs. Indeed, many out-of-control dogs will never come to notice of enforcement agencies because of a lack of understanding of the legislation coupled with poor implementation. There is, however, external data which suggests that the Act and/or its enforcement is not working as it was intended. Reports indicate that dog bites have gone up in some cases by 80% since the Act came into force. And data released by the NHS showed a similar trend, albeit at less alarming rate. Their figures showing that in 2006 the number of admissions to hospital due to dog bites was 115, and in 2015 it had risen to 155, an increase of 35%. The Act itself has put in place a potentially effective framework for which many animal welfare charities publicly commended the government. And dog control notices, if used correctly, can be proportionate and timely. There is a strong argument that they should remain, as potentially they are a valuable tool for tackling dog-related antisocial behaviour, but things really do need to change. The Act allows for local authority officers to serve DCNs, however it does not allow the police to issue these notices. In 2012 and 2013, police in Scotland dealt with 1,177 and 1,012 incidents respectively in relation to dogs. However, only 239 dog control notices were issued by local authorities. Yes.
Christine Graham.
I thank the member. Were you surprised, as I was, that the NFUS, many members of the NFUS, were unaware of the Control of Dogs Act, which we have great use to farmers, but they simply didn't know about it?
Finlay Carson.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more, and I think that goes right across all sectors, not just farmers that weren't aware of the Act. There was a distinct lack of publicity over it. Although the figures in detection have increased to 290 in 2015-16, it's clear that more can be done and needs to be done to support local authorities, in particular in their enforcement. But I believe that a root and branch review for all dog control legislation to address this problem would be widely welcomed. And as I highlighted when I attended the committee, I believe there is a danger that there is currently too much legislation currently lined up to go through Parliament simultaneously in relation to dog welfare and dog control. For example, we've heard about Christine Graham's dog bill designed at tackling irresponsible dog breeding, Emma Harper's bill to tackle livestock worrying, and my colleague Jeremy Balfour's bill to give better protection to animals that are sold in pet shops. Those, along with increased animal cruelty sentences and perhaps future puppy farming and trafficking and dog walking legislation. I'd like to stress that in no way do I aim to undermine my fellow members for bringing forward these issues and understand the amount of work that goes into Members' Bill. However, currently the laws on dangerous and out-of-control dogs is fragmented between various acts and statutory instruments, both devolved and at the UK level. I, along with other animal welfare organisations, believe that this is a timely opportunity to consolidate the provision of the Act with other dog control laws to ensure both enforcers and the public are clearly aware of what their respective roles and responsibilities are. I would urge the Minister to seriously consider an approach that looks at the consolidation of dog control laws to address not only the not fit for purpose legislation, but could also promote and ensure responsible dog breeding, sales and ownership, many of which believe, as we've heard, including Stuart Stevenson and Alec Neil, is at the heart of the problem of out-of-control dogs as a result often of out-of-control owners. On a positive note, the Community Safety Minister did respond to me saying that she thinks the government should look at a one-size-fits-all approach. And I hope that remains her position 6 months on and that we get it right for our communities and people like John Diggle. We must see local authorities supported in relation to warden and officers. There simply isn't enough of these people on the ground to enforce the Act in our rural communities. I applaud my fellow members in the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Committee for their recommendations, showing the power of Parliament's committees in pushing for review of legislation when current laws are not working. I'd like to put on record my thanks to Battersea Dog Home and others for the briefings, and I hope that today's debate is the first step in ensuring we get dog control laws that will probably be interpreted, enforced and help to reduce the number of appalling attacks.
I now call Ash Denham for up to 7 minutes, please, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think this has been a constructive debate on the comprehensive report prepared by the committee. Once again, I thank the committee members and the clerking team for their excellent work in preparing the report, and I also thank those who took the time to offer their views to help inform the report as well. It's right that this Parliament takes the time to look back at previous legislation and assess how it is operating. And it's only by doing so that we can seek to learn lessons for the future and help to improve the practical impact different pieces of legislation can make. The report published and today's debate are testimony of the value of the work done by the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee, and I thank them for that work that they have done. Presiding Officer, we've heard today about the tragic impact that dog attacks can have. A number of members across the Chamber made contributions that included that. Dog owners must be responsible and keep their dogs under effective control. That much is clear. The way in which our laws work and the way in which these laws are enforced are both critical as well. And last week I published a review seeking views on improving the operational effectiveness of the Control of Dogs Act of 2010. Local authorities have a key role to play here in keeping communities safe through the use of their powers under the 2010 Act. But the laws must be appropriate to help them to do this. So the review seeks views on better enforcement measures, such as...
Jenny Mara.
I thank the Minister for giving way. I'm just very conscious, Presiding Officer, that for the timescale of these reviews, because the Government's going to be doing 2 reviews or consultations, one immediately and one throughout 2020. But by the end of 2020, we only have about 4 months left of this Parliament. What timescale does she foresee new legislation coming forward? Is it possible this Parliament, and can she commit to that today?
Ash Denham.
Well, the review that's currently underway obviously is seeking to look at things that we can do in the short term in order to address the enforcement of the 2010 Act. The review that we're carrying out next year is obviously going to have a much wider look, and I'm afraid I could not commit to timescales for any changes that might be undertaken under that wider review that we will be carrying out next year. So we are looking at, as part of the consultation we're currently carrying out, things such as a new offence of obstructing a local authority officer and new fixed penalty notice powers for breaches of dog control notices. And the review also explores how a national dog notice database could be established to aid enforcement of dog control notices across Scotland. And obviously that point was picked up by members across the chamber, including Jenny Mara in her contribution, that the government should seek to establish the database and not carry out the consultation. So I just wanted to clarify that the 2010 Act requires consultation by the government before the database can be established. It is a statutory requirement which the Scottish Government must follow. I want to also use the opportunity now to pick up on a number of contributions that were made in the debate. So Alec, Neil made a number of points around consolidation of the laws, a point about the carrying out of the wider review and about licensing, and I want to assure him that I will consider the points that he made very carefully. Donald Cameron, Liam Kerr and Willie Coffey also made mention of the number and also the severity of attacks on postal workers whilst carrying out their work. Christine Graham, in her contribution, and obviously she was the member who originally brought forward the legislation, reiterated, I think, the intent of the original legislation to be a preventative regime. So this idea of stopping out-of-control dogs going on to become dangerous dogs. She also made the point, which I think is an important point, about awareness raising. I did take note of that as well from the committee's report, and I do intend to run an awareness raising campaign starting this year. And I will also take on board Jenny Mara's point that she made around making that campaign accessible or directed to children. I'll give that some thought. Colin Beattie made a compelling point around data sharing. So the point that he made was about the contents of dog control notices, sharing that information with those who had reported the dog. And that, I think he'd be pleased to know, that does feature in the review, because we did take that on board as being an important point as well. I will.
Alex Neil.
Can I thank the Minister for taking the intervention? Can I just make the point that obviously some of the legislation being referred to that's proposed for the Chamber is the responsibility of another department. Will she ensure that the Government takes a joined-up approach to this and everybody sings from the same hymn sheet? Because that's extremely important, obviously, to achieve the objectives.
Ash Denham.
Yes, the member is quite right to make that point, and I will undertake to make sure that we are working in a joined-up fashion across government to address that. The Scottish Government is committed to keeping communities safe from out-of-control dogs. Understanding the extent of the current problems associated with irresponsible dog ownership is critical in that fact, and all changes to the law must be evidence-based, and that's why we are seeking to put in place better recording of data relating to injuries caused by dogs, and that's why that's so important. Changes would also need independent enforcement agencies to use their powers in relation to dog control more consistently and more effectively, and that was a point that was also made by a number of members in their contributions today. A wider review of dog control law in 2020 through a consultation looking at the Dangerous Dogs Act of 1991 and other associated legislation will help assess how the overall legislative regime can be improved and if it should be modernised. Presiding Officer, whilst legislation does certainly have a role to play, how independent enforcement agencies use their powers is fundamental to an effective dog control regime. And the report sadly found a wide variation in how local authorities use their powers under the 2010 Act, and that point was picked up by a number of speakers. New data that the Scottish Government has received from local authorities merely highlighted this variation in approach. And this data was provided to the committee last week, and it shows that some local authorities do not even have one dog warden. While it's obviously a matter for local authorities themselves to determine their local priorities, clearly changes to legislation will have little impact if local authorities don't prioritise activity in this area. So just to sum up, one dog attack is one attack too many. I am committed to looking at the legislative framework right across this area to identify what more can be done in order to keep our communities safe.
I now call Liam Kerr to close on behalf of the committee for up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very pleased to be here closing this debate on behalf of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in my capacity as Deputy Convener. But it is a debate that I wish was not necessary. Like the Convener, I would like to put on record my thanks to everyone who provided the committee with evidence as part of its post-legislative scrutiny of the Control of Dogs Act and, of course, the clerks. In particular, I would like to thank the people who shared their experiences of dog attacks, especially the parents who bravely recounted the attacks on their children. Presiding Officer, over the last 3.5 years, I've listed some pretty challenging and difficult things in this place, and I can honestly say that the session we had in February 2019, in which various families shared their experiences, was amongst the most powerful and harrowing testimony I have ever heard. I went back and read the official report before today's session. There is a piece of testimony by Veronica Lynch, which I could never forget, and like Bill Bowman, I'm unable to bring myself to repeat it today. And that reminded me again that, as Alex Rowley flagged, this is a national crisis. Donald Cameron brought up the Communication Workers Union's evidence that there were 250 dog attacks on postal workers in Scotland last year. There have been 2,500 postal workers attacked in Scotland since the 2010 Act came into force. And the convener said there have been 129 such attacks since April. That is 6 months. Now, I joined an Aberdeen postie on his round last year, and he told me that in one stare he delivered to, there was a known, aggressive, violent dog which charged at the door and tried to attack him each time he delivered. Eventually, the door happened to be ajar, and this man, doing his job, was brutally attacked, leading to extensive time off work, post-traumatic issues, and surgery. And the convener was right to flag care workers, delivery drivers, who, remember, are not included in that shocking 129 attacks statistic. And the reality is that people aren't aware of this, which was a point made succinctly and saliently by Christine Graham. In Alec Neil's debate in May 2018, she made the important point that for the 2010 Act to be effective, the public have to know that that is the law, but the public at large have no idea of the legislation. Christine Graham was right today that the Scottish Government should initiate a public awareness campaign to educate the public about the provisions of the 2010 Act. And I'm pleased to hear about the social media and local authority campaigns. But we must have a clearer timescale, and I hope the committee receives that by return. But what are we informing them about? Because during the committee's oral evidence sessions, we heard of a lack of available and consistent data, a point raised by Colin Beattie. For example, we heard from Dr. Alistair Corfield from the Royal College of Emergency Medicine. He estimated the numbers of around 5,000 dog bites in Scotland were probably an underestimate, on the basis that some victims wouldn't attend A&E, particularly if the bite wasn't severe. Now, I heard the Minister acknowledge the lack of data, but I didn't hear whether recording and collection would be dealt with urgently, and I very much hope to in committee very shortly. And public knowledge is one thing. It is even worse if our local authorities haven't got the knowledge. Bill Bowman and many others pointed out the Scottish Government has failed to introduce a Scottish dog control database mandated by the 2010 Act. Detailed analysis of the statistics gathered could increase the effectiveness of future evidence-based policies in this area. And if we had a database of verbal and written warnings issued in respect of out-of-control dogs, then this could be used when considering reasonable apprehension. Police Scotland told the committee it would be a great form of evidence. If we were building a case under the 1991 Act, we could use that register to demonstrate proof that a dog had been subject to a dog control notice or that warning letters had been issued. Now, sticking with this issue of enforcement, during evidence and as discussed by James Kelly, we heard that a lack of local authority officers appointed to enforce the 2010 Act, along with, as Willie Coffey brought up, the sufficiency of training that was provided could be a barrier to the effectiveness of the Act. And the committee noted the evidence from the National Dog Warden Association that many of the existing dog wardens were struggling with the workload. As Blue Cross put it in their briefing, it is futile passing legislation if the requisite resources are not made available to those statutorily charged with implementing its provisions. Lack of enforcement equates to a lack of deterrence. The committee recognised the importance of having sufficient numbers of suitably trained local authority officers and asked the Scottish Government to collect this information to help inform its review. Now, Finlay Carson and many others pointed out that the complicated network of legislation makes it confusing and unclear for enforcers to know which piece of legislation to use, who is responsible for enforcing it and when to apply it. Alex Rowley picked up the committee's words. The landscape is not fit for purpose. Now, I heard the Minister say the police had inconsistent knowledge of the powers and there was wide variation in local authority use of powers. But I respectfully suggest that they are not really the issue here. If Alex Neil is right that the powers are contained in legislation that dates back to the 19th century, then it is no wonder that there is an issue, and that is for government to address. Now, the solution proposed by the committee is that consolidation of dog control law could improve clarity for the public, local authorities and the police on the handing out of control and dangerous dogs. A modern, consolidated act of the Scottish Parliament on dog control law is required. I hope the government will look very carefully at this and ensure it doesn't get lost in the too difficult pile. If it's very brief, please.
Emma Harper.
Thank you. I thank Liam Kerr for taking that intervention. The 2010 legislation focuses on control of dogs and out-of-control dogs, but most of the report focused on dog bites and for postal workers and things. But the legislation only mentions one line about dogs attacking other animals. Does he agree that we do need separate legislation for livestock worrying?
Liam Kerr.
I'm speaking on behalf of the committee, and the committee certainly finds that there is a need for consolidated legislation. I do accept the point. I think it's very important that what the members brought up about that there are attacks that go far wider than simply on people. But I do think that the committee's recommendation is about a consolidated piece of legislation. Presiding Officer, on behalf of the committee, I would like to thank everyone who's taken part in this afternoon's debate and the many solutions proposed. It has been powerful, moving and timely. But this process must not end today. I am very concerned at the Minister's inability to commit to timescales following the convener's intervention. Alex Neil called his members' debate in May 2018. It was harrowing. The Chamber all agreed that something needed to be done. Yet in March this year, he was moved to say, it does seem that there's a total lack of leadership and indeed complacency on the part of the Justice Department over this problem. This problem of dog attacks is very serious and it's something the government needs to get a grip of as a priority. Presiding Officer, in February, the committee heard chilling, disturbing testimony. For those watching, please be aware that what follows is highly distressing and vulnerable viewers may wish to mute this bit. The committee heard Claire Booth's son Ryan was 6 when a white English bull terrier came running out of the trees and knocked him to the ground. The dog covered his whole body and it was followed very quickly by another English bull terrier which ran right into him. The scene was carnage. We noticed right away that Ryan's ear was off the side of his head. The owner was in the background shouting out, "Don't worry, the dogs won't touch you." Claire told us Ryan will have to undergo another 3 operations to remove cartilage from his sternum, attach it to his ear and rebuild his ear with a skin graft. There has been a traumatic effect on his entire childhood. He does not want to go to places where he should be striving to go as a little boy. Our younger children now have a huge fear of dogs. I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and had to go through cognitive behavioural therapy. Presiding Officer, today's debate must trigger action. We must not ignore Ryan Booth, Kelly Lynch, Rihanna Grady, John Diggle and all the other postal workers we've heard about, and so many, many others who have been attacked. The time for talking is long past. The time for action is now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and that concludes our debate on post-legislative scrutiny of the Control of Dogs Act. We're now going to move on to the next item of business, which is a committee announcement, and can I call Bob Doris, convener of the Social Security Committee, to make an announcement on the committee's inquiry into benefit take-up. Mr Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As convener of the Social Security Committee, I am pleased to announce today that we have launched an inquiry into benefit take-up. Statistics from HMRC and the DWP estimated that in 2016-17, only 31% of families without children who are eligible for working tax credit and only 6% of those eligible for pension credit claimed the benefits they were entitled to. Whilst the full number of benefits which go unclaimed is unknown due to difficulties in estimating eligibility, we want to explore how take-up rates for both the reserve and devolved social security benefits can be improved. As a committee, we will investigate some of the reasons behind people not claiming, whether this is stigma associated with benefits, a general lack of awareness around entitlement, or the complexity of the application process. We also want to investigate what can be done to address this issue. So we'll be looking at previous efforts to promote take-up and investigate how technology, for example, can be used to automate some benefits. The Scottish Government will also be publishing its benefits take-up strategy in October, which will set out how the Government intends to promote take-up of the new Scottish social security benefits. As entitlement to some of these benefits is linked to being in receipt of the UK benefit, we'll explore what impact this could have on their level of take-up also. To inform our views, we are engaging with stakeholders, organisations and individuals to answer 9 key questions. Presiding Officer, they are: 1, what we do know about how much is unclaimed and why. 2, what are the gaps in knowledge, research and how can these be improved? Thirdly, how can the administration of benefits be improved to maximise take-up? 4, how, as far as possible, can technology be used to create a more automated system that uses information gathered for other reasons to award benefits automatically? What would the advantages and disadvantages be of that greater automation? Fifthly, Presiding Officer, what can we learn from previous campaigns to increase take-up? Are different approaches required for different benefits and different client groups? What kinds of eligibility criteria ensure better take-up? How might the development of Scottish social security impact on both the take-up of reserved and devolved benefits? And finally, how are there other questions that you, all the stakeholders and MSPs out there think we should be considering as part of this inquiry? As well as the written and oral evidence, the committee wants to hear from people with lived experience of the benefits system. In the run-up to Challenge Poverty Week, which starts next Monday, some members of the committee will be visiting the North West Glasgow Citizens Advice Bureau to hear from some advice workers and their clients this week about some of the reasons why people do not claim the benefits they are entitled to. We look forward to reporting back to the Parliament with our findings and recommendations in the new year. And thank you for the opportunity, Presiding Officer, to make this announcement to the Chamber here this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Mr Doris. We now move on to the next item of business, which is decision time. There's just the one question this evening. The question is that motion 19160 in the name of Jenny Mara on post-legislative scrutiny Control of Dogs Scotland Act 2010 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed, and that concludes decision time. We're going to move on shortly to members' business in the name of Anas Sarwar on the 80th year of Scotland's Citizens Advice Service, but we'll just take a few moments for members and ministers to change seats. Just pause a few moments.